Hi again then guys, and welcome to a review which might seem a little bit strange. Why go back to day one in effect in the game to review a car that we've probably already all driven? So why are we? Well, of course because we're featuring every car in the game that deserves to be reviewed, which is essentially every car. There are some exceptions, like cars that are just multiple versions of the exact same thing, like the BMW M6 for instance, but this one is most definitely deserving of its own review because way back, in fact one of my earliest rivals matches in Gran Turismo Sport was between this and its current best rival, the Camaro. Now this one is of course the Mustang GT from 2015, new shape, new style, a new life, you could say, breathed or pumped into the new car. Now, as far as the engines go on these Mustangs, I personally really like the lower grade models with the Ecoboost, I believe it's Ecoboost Engines, not Ecotech, with those 2-litre 4-cylinder motors, which you would never expect to be in a car of this size, but I love that kind of thing. I love those ultra tiny engines that Ford put a lot of effort into developing, those 1-litre Focuses. They even put one in, of course, the Ecoboost Formula Ford, the road car, which again, incredible use of that kind of tech. Now this one could seem on paper to be a more traditional, bullish approach. It's just got that big, lazy 5-litre V8 engine. It's just old school muscle or pony car, as some people more specifically say, of course. But it's not. It's much more than that. This isn't just another muscle car, just another big V8. It's significantly improved. It's more efficient. Because after all, these days, it has to be. It's not a choice anymore, even for America. Their cars have to become better, they have to become more fuel efficient, reduce their emissions, all that kind of stuff. But it's not all doom and gloom, because often that will end up giving you better performance, because it's more efficient in terms of the performance side of things and the power and the torque side of things, not just fuel. And that's the great thing here, because it is more responsive and faster than you would typically expect not necessarily a low-level Mustang to be, but the fact that the performance on this one, which is of course the GT, which is the fast but not the fastest, it's nowhere near a GT 500, it's actually similar to the kind of track performance of the previous generation's GT 500. Now, of course, the power is nowhere near as high. It's got 434 horsepower, 400 pound-feet of torque, but what it can actually do with those numbers is where you see the big improvements in terms of the engine tech, the performance tech, and something which I actually noticed while I was doing this review, while I was driving the car that I hadn't picked up on before, which I actually found very interesting, is that if you cut a line above the door on this car and just look at the shape of the window and the roof, tell me that doesn't look like an Aston Martin DB9, because that window is almost identical to an Aston Martin DB9 and also the Virage as well, and I think that's pretty cool. If you can have a Mustang that looks like an Aston Martin, at least in part, I think that's just inherently awesome, and that's coming from someone who isn't even a Mustang fan, generally speaking, and I know that's not a popular opinion. That's just personal taste for you. Now, this one in the video is, as you can see from its speed and the way I'm throwing it around, not exactly stock. In fact, it's putting out over 700 horsepower. But here's the thing. This is another occasion where you can see just how much the Mustang's performance has improved, even though other stuff like suspension and tyres are also marked up as well. This is only 1 second slower than my McLaren F1 around this track in the same category, N700. Now, of course, this has more power. As I said, it's over 700 horsepower to the McLaren F1's, whatever it was when I drove it, like 650, 660, something like that, because it was slightly upgraded. And it's about a second quicker than my Aventador. Again, in the same class, N700, and that car does have 700 horsepower, so it's not exactly like it's got a disadvantage. Plus, of course, the McLaren has the big advantage of being so well engineered. The Aventador has a massive advantage of all-wheel drive. The only real thing that the Mustang has going for it is racing hard tyres, but beyond that, a car that puts down that kind of power and torque is still not going to automatically be the quickest just because of its tyres. Because as you can see in the video, it's still very tail happy. It loves to flick its tail out, fishtail around, full-on spin out if you'll let it. But the second lap, as you could see in the video from the cockpit cam footage, was the quickest, and I wasn't driving that in cockpit cam, but that was the lap where I decided to just hold back the power a little bit, let it basically take its time a bit more through the corners, but the overall result was it ended up being quicker than my happy-go-lucky laps, if you will. And of course those were played up to look cool as well, to some degree, with drifting, doing 360s, that kind of stuff. But the great thing about this Mustang in GT Sport is it manages to be a middle ground between the extreme performance that you'd usually expect from a GT 500 and more of the understated appeal in kind of a sleeper way, but also in terms of price, that a non-GT 500 or a non-Boss model will have, because the Mustang GTs, historically speaking in the franchise, they're not that expensive. You can pick up one on Gran Turismo 6 for 25 grand, and there's one of them for 48 grand, and that's the full premium. This one's only 44 grand. That's great value. Now, it's still more expensive than the Camaro, which is 35, but for a Mustang fan, it's not only nice to have the newer representation of it in the game, but it's nice to also know that you can go into it and actually have a lot of fun and potentially get a lot of use out of the car, especially now that you can of course reduce the power, again, as we could in previous Gran Turismo titles for a little while, but not all the time, so you can get it into lower classes as well if you want to, and I would strongly recommend trying that out, because the weight in particular is what you need to focus on when it comes to something like this or a Camaro, because both of them weigh well over 1600 kilos, which is more than an SLR McLaren, so they're pretty heavy cars. Now, if you drop that weight, even if you don't increase the power, in fact you could even decrease it, for instance, to N300 if you wanted to, and they would still be great around the track, because the weight is really the only thing holding these cars back. If you lower that, the rest pretty much takes care of itself. Now, something which I said in the Rivals match between this and the Camaro does still stand, and that is that sometimes these cars can be too playful for their own good, and that's not too surprising. I mean, you'd expect a car like this to be like that. But thankfully with the Mustang, and the Camaro as well actually, which we'll also review at some point, they're not uncontrolled. And of course the more power you give it, the more difficult it is to get a fast lap while keeping the car in line. But under general circumstances with say 300 to 500 horsepower, or anywhere in between, it's actually not all that difficult to control the car. Will it be the quickest in class? No, there are definitely quicker things around. A Porsche GT3, for instance, will pretty easily dispatch this car, but of course it will. I mean, you wouldn't expect it to be anything else. The fact that its lap times were in the same ballpark, even as a McLaren F1 and an Aventador, albeit tuned of course, but still equal level to them, it shows the raw potential that this Mustang has, and as I've said before on the channel in other reviews, the fact that I'm not a huge fan of the Mustang doesn't change the respect I have for how quick a car it is. So overall, if you haven't checked it out, I mean, it's been out for a while, day one on the game, so definitely give it a try. You might not use it all the time, but you'll probably have a lot of fun in it. But that's it for this particular review. Of course, I'll see you guys next time, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.